There we go.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, and do give me the time warnings. And I am going to talk about, I added Savannah River Site to the title. And I do think that South Carolina is the center of new nuclear arms race. So I'll just read some of this. The moral, financial, and security dilemmas created by the Manhattan Project are as alive today as even if the decision makers downplay them, military contractors profit from them, and if the public and media choose to ignore them. The threat of nuclear war and nuclear proliferation are real and must be addressed. So how do we get to the point that we remain poised for nuclear confrontation, with the Department of Energy Savannah River Site playing a key role in planning for nuclear war? What can we do to confront and change this situation and break through the chronic secrecy by DOE and the Department of Energy and the lack of public awareness and engagement?
Yes.
Yep.
You're delayed. Okay, so looking back at the Oppenheimer movie in particular, there were 3 nuclear devices that are talked about in the movie. The first one was the Trinity test on July 16th, 1945, and we can talk about that if people have questions. The Little Boy Hiroshima bomb, which was a highly enriched uranium bomb, and the plutonium bomb Fat Man that was dropped on Nagasaki. And I would add that plutonium has a radioactive half-life of 24,000 years. Those are 2 models of the bomb that are on display at the Los Alamos Museum, where I actually was a few weeks ago. And Jay is going to be there next week. And Jay has just returned from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, by the way. And I visited the Peace Dome there in Hiroshima. So from the 3 sites that were involved in the Manhattan Project, those being Los Alamos, Hanford, and Oak Ridge, which is now called the Y-12 site, it was then called Clinton Engineering Works, the weapons complex has become a massive coast-to-coast operation, supposedly for defense, right? And you can see the names of the current sites that are in the U.S. Department of Energy complex, with Savannah River Site being here just across the river from Georgia. So the National Nuclear Security Administration is really being honest when they call this an enterprise. It really is a business enterprise that run all these sites. And the enterprise loyally serves a client. And ask yourself, who is the client? And I'll answer the question. The client is the U.S. The Pentagon, the Department of Nuclear Weapons, really. The complex of the Department of Energy is run by private contractors with some DOE oversight and minimal congressional oversight. We find that once they give the money, the oversight just kind of goes to the side. At Savannah River.
5, Tom.
Okay, there are 2 corporations, the Fluor Corporation and Newport News Nuclear. Savannah River Site was created in the 1950s. About 5,000 people were relocated. That was under the Atomic Energy Commission at the time. And then it was originally the Savannah River Plant, then became the Savannah River Site in 1989. And the triangles on that map on the right are where the nuclear reactors are located. There were 5 of them. That looks like this K reactor that produced weapon-grade plutonium. That's a reprocessing plant that separated the plutonium. Hundreds of millions of gallons of high-level nuclear waste were created as a byproduct of producing nuclear weapons materials that were pumped into 51 tanks. That material is being removed from the tanks and vitrified in these large containers. 4,500 of them have been filled, and we don't really know where it's going to go. So you may well remember when President Biden talked about the risk of World War III, when, and I'll call him the Russian dictator, threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And he well knew what he was talking about because the US policy is basically to plan for nuclear war. But they couch it in terms like deterrence. But that's really not what it's play. It's really a threat of a full-scale nuclear war, and that's laid out in the National Defense Strategy from early last year. Under the New START Treaty, the U.S. only has allowed 1,550 deployed weapons, but about 2,500 or more weapons in reserve, and they're ready to fight the nuclear war, unfortunately. And it's a stark reality that most people don't know. So in order to build new nuclear weapons, the U.S. Put forward a proposal in 2018 to make the plutonium pits the core of the nuclear weapons at Savannah River Site and Los Alamos. $5 billion was spent on the building on the right, which was to produce plutonium fuel, and it was canceled in 2017 after all that money was wasted. And now the proposal is to convert it into the plutonium bomb plant at a conversion cost of $11 billion. That's a cost from 2 years ago. That we're going to get a new estimate in 2025, and it could cost $20 billion or more for that facility, which could make it the most expensive building in U.S. history. And then they want to get $1 billion a year to operate the facility once it's converted. So I want to add that here in South Carolina, the South Carolina Environmental Law Project is representing my group, Jay's group, and Tri-Valley Cares in Livermore, California. And we're demanding that a programmatic environmental impact statement be done on plutonium pit production to analyze all the environmental impacts, including disposal of the plutonium waste in a facility, waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico. The Savannah River Site has no technical knowledge about pit production. So this new mission, they have absolutely no experience, and that's reflected by the timeline for producing 50 or more of these pits a year has already drifted from 2030 to 2036. They also have very little, or they have no experience actually handling the pits, storing them, just in a facility SRS. They don't even know how to do that. And SRS does not have any experience in producing plutonium pucks. In the past, the plutonium that was produced at Savannah River Site was made into kind of pucks that were shipped to the Rocky Flats site in Colorado, but that was shut down due to environmental reasons in the mid-1980s. There's no demonstrated need for the new nuclear warheads, and I think Jay is going to talk about that, into which these new plutonium pits that only weigh a few kilograms would go. DOE's refused to discuss reuse of stored pits, and there are about 2,000 of them already in storage at the Pantex site in Texas. And pit production at SRS, I'm about to wind this up, will distract from the needed focus to stay on cleaning up the site and removing high-level waste from the tanks. Pit production is only going to siphon money away from the cleanup mission. So pit production also means more plutonium coming into SRS. And we know about that in South Carolina, that there was a lawsuit to have the plutonium removed. So we have been placed at ground zero of a new potential arms race with Russia and China, with really out discussion of the people here. There's a lot of things.
Tom.
There's a lot. So I'll close it.
Half a minute.
Yeah, I'll close it now. So what can we do? And there's opportunities for a lot of media engagement, letters to the editor, op-eds. We need to demonstrate a unified public action in opposition against the pit project. And what local people did at the Oppenheimer and Barbie movies were quite impressive. They handed out hundreds of leaflets. You can see a picture here of some of our local activists, and we need to stimulate more public participation like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Yes, thank you. With that, we will hand things over to Jay. Jay, welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to screen share. Let's see. The usual technical problems.
Okay.
Once again, please remind people to put your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
I know I have a lot bubbling up from our last speaker, and I know I've got even more with Nuclear Watch New Mexico, I'm sure.
Let's let Jace begin.
Okay, and first of all, you can see my beginning slide, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Thumbs
moving
up.
on. I want to give some context first for the federal government's aggressive plan for plutonium pit production. And first of all, the relevant agency is called the National Nuclear Security Administration. That's the Department of Energy's semi-autonomous nuclear weapons agency. But to give this broad context, first of all, the Pentagon has identified expanded pit production as the number one modernization issue. And modernization is a $2 trillion plan to completely make over US nuclear forces. Now, about 2/3 of that 2 trillion will go to new missiles, subs, and bombers. The remaining third actually goes to the nuclear weapons laboratories and production plants, such as Los Alamos and the Savannah River site. But in short, bottom line, it's a new arms race with nuclear weapons forever. And then to get down, to make clear what a plutonium pit is, it's like the pit of a peach. I went to Russia once, and my fact sheet was mistranslated as a hole in the ground, and I had a very puzzled Russian audience. So just to clear up that one little fact, it's like the pit of a peach, not a hole in the ground, but it's the radioactive core of a nuclear weapon. It is also an atomic bomb by itself, as the destruction of Nagasaki shows. And I was in Nagasaki just last week. The US has not had industrial scale pit production since the FBI shut down Rocky Flats in 1989. So all of this is about resuming industrial scale plutonium pit production for expanded nuclear weapons production. The current plans are to produce 30 or more pits per year at Los Alamos and 50 or more at the Savannah River site. It looks like Los Alamos is more or less on track, but the same certainly cannot be said for Savannah River. It originally was supposed to produce that by 2030. I have 2036 here. Congressional staff have told Tom and myself that it's even more like 2040. And all of this is after sunk costs into the MOX project in the order of $6 to $7 billion. That's going to end up being a $20 billion facility. As Tom's already said, the likely to be the most expensive building in US history. Biden keeps adding to pit production. There's 2.77 billion that he's asking for in the pending fiscal year, and costs are going to exceed over 60 billion over 30 years. Now I get to why expanded pit production is not necessary. And if there's any one take-home point that I would like you all to get, it is the fact that zero, zilch pit production, future production, is to maintain the safety and reliability of the existing stockpile. So again, I want you all to take that home. I think it's fundamental in understanding why expanded pit production is wrong. One reason that there is no pit production to maintain the existing stockpile is the existing stockpile simply doesn't need it. And as previously stated, an independent study in 2006 concluded that pits last at least a century. Their average age now is around 40 years. And there's already at least 15,000, it's probably more like 20,000 existing pits stored at the Pantex plant near Amarillo. So it's all future pit production is all about new speculative, new design nuclear weapons. To get wonky, it's specifically the W-87-1 warhead and the W-93 warhead, which are coming on deck. Again, they are new designs. And a great danger here is that we already know that future pit designs will be modified. We don't know how seriously, but there's the NNSA and the labs are very aggressive about this. And it's fairly safe to speculate that as time goes on, tested designs will become more and more heavily modified. And this raises reliability issues, and perhaps even more seriously could prompt the US to resume nuclear weapons testing, which obviously would have very severe global non-proliferation consequences.
All right, Jay, 4.
Okay. I'm just saying 4 minutes left.
Or yes, sir.
Yeah. Programmatic problems. The Department of Energy is notorious for wasting taxpayers' money. And in fact, it's been on the GAO's high risk list for project mismanagement ever since GAO started that list in 1991. The title of the GAO report released in January says it all for pit production. NNSA, here's the most expensive project NNSA has ever undertaken, and it doesn't even have credible cost estimates. It is out to fleece the taxpayer. A continuing problem has been the lack of updated pit aging studies, which obviously the issue of pit aging is central to whether or not we need pit production. And I would assert that NNSA has been assiduously avoiding new updated studies. Another programmatic problem is the waste isolation pilot plant in southern New Mexico. And this can kind of be a serious choke point for radioactive waste coming from expanded pit production, which, by the way, it's projected there'll be 57,000 cubic meters over 30 years of additional bomb-making waste from expanded production. DOE assumes that it can rely on WIP for up to 2050 for future waste disposals, but New Mexico is becoming more assertive about exercising greater control over WIP. So in short, WIP could be the pit production's Achilles heel. So get to goals, eliminate the congressional requirement for 80 pits per year. That really just reflects reality. Stop plutonium pit production at Savannah River. We simply don't need it. We already have limited production at Los Alamos. Cut plutonium modernization funding, get a new pit aging study. There should be a new programmatic environmental impact statement on pit production. The last one was in 2008, and NNSA is avoiding doing another one. I threw the last item in part to embarrass Tom, but as I'm fond of saying, I've known Tom for 30 years. He's not much to look at, but he's got notches on his pistol. He's had victory after victory. He was the lone voice in the wilderness saying that MOX was never going to work. He was saying that 15, 20 years ago, and he's right. He's been proven right. So I know that Tom feels kind of alone out there in South Carolina, and I see I'm succeeding in embarrassing him, which was my aim, but support Tom. Just to close, just to close, just to make no bones what it's all about. This is an internal Los Alamos lab slide. It's not the kind of thing that they show in public. But this is what it's all about. This is what pit production is about. It is about genocidal weapons. I mentioned that I was just in Nagasaki last week. This is actually from the Catholic Cathedral in Nagasaki, which Well, it was just a few hundred meters from the hypocenter when the blast went off. So that's actually a bust of Mary that was singed by the plutonium bomb itself. And I'm closing with, we need new approaches. That pictures of Catholic archbishops last week signing a statement, a formal partnership to work on nuclear disarmament. And I want to point out the Non-Proliferation Treaty is failing, and that we should support the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And then just to finally close, it's taken me a long time to realize this, but we really need to build a movement. And ironically, we've been creamed politically ever since Obama took office, a supposedly liberal president. And at least in my 30 years plus experience, logic, lawsuits, common sense, the facts don't seem to work. We need to build a movement to turn politicians around. And maybe the film Oppenheimer is a start towards that end.
Thank you, Tom.
it's
I mean,
good.
Jay,
Good the
I'm sorry.
discussion that it started. So
Thank you.
that's
All
it.
right.
All right, am I on?
You are on, Dave.
Okay, can y'all see me? Okay, I want to piggyback on what Jay is saying, because the Carolina Peace Resource Center was started during the peace freeze movement during the early 80s, when the Reagan administration was doing buildup and saber rattling. And it is a movement that we need to build again, a broad-based movement for peace and justice. But let me jump into my presentation. I wanted to look at the historical legacy of Oppenheimer. I wanted to see what we could learn from the history of it. And I ran into two men, one that Oppenheimer didn't listen to, and one that wouldn't listen to Oppenheimer. The first one, next slide, is Leo Szilard. Leo Szilard probably has a better claim to being the father of the atomic bomb. Brilliant Hungarian Jewish physicist, an ideas man, a visionary. He went to Berlin and sought out Einstein to work with. He fled the Nazis right after the Reichstag's fire. He decided you don't have to be more clever than everybody else. Barely getting out, he decided you just have to be one day ahead. And that's what he was when he escaped Nazi Germany. He always kept 2 suitcases packed after that. He's a flashy, brash, contrarian. He's a pacifist, but he's also arrogant, abrasive, and a gadfly. But he does ask the right questions. He's the one who realizes that a nuclear chain reaction is possible, and then also implication is there could be a powerful bomb. He immigrates to the United States in 1938, and when the Nazis rise up, like in the war,
said there was a person slumped over at the table because she wasn't sure if he was alive.
Szilard helps to craft the Einstein-Szilard letter in 1939 to FDR to inform him of the possibility of an atomic bomb, because he's worried about the Nazi threat. And Einstein and Szilard are both pacifists, but that Nazi threat is a danger, and that's what initiates the Manhattan Project. And Szilard is working on that from the very beginning. General Groves doesn't like him and sidelines him eventually, and he gets stuck at the Chicago Met Lab, and eventually gets wound up being chased by basically spies and people who are watching him. Like Oppenheimer, he thought that the atomic bomb had to be demonstrated in war against a city. But in 1945, he changes his mind. Germany surrenders. He realizes that it's not morally justified to drop atomic bombs on Japanese cities. He goes to meet with Oppenheimer, completely clashes. There are completely two minds on that. He would meet with FDR, but FDR has just passed away. So he has to try to meet with Truman. Truman passes him off to his new assistant, his new Secretary of State, James F. Burns. Burns, he goes to his home in Greenville by train to meet with him, and Burns flatly rejects passing along his concerns to Truman. Not only does he think that it's not morally justified, he also thinks that using the atomic bomb will set off an arms race with the Soviets, and the Soviets would have a bomb within 5 years. Now, as a last-ditch measure, Szilard tries to put together a petition to the president. Oh yeah, we do have to move forward. I'm sorry. Go ahead and go through those slides, please. Go to the next slide, please. All right, there's Truman and Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns actually made his political career in Aiken. Started off as a stenographer, then a lawyer, and then became a politician, and then became Mr. Assistant President. He was in charge of war mobilization. He was a big deal under FDR, and then became the Secretary of State. So the Szilard petition was to the fellow Manhattan Project scientists, saying that at least give Japan the terms of surrender before you use the atomic bomb. Szilard's own position was a lot more strident than that, but in order to get people to sign a petition, he does that. He tries to get Edward Teller at Los Alamos to circulate a petition, but Oppenheimer shuts him down. Oppenheimer says it's not the role of us scientists. They let the policymakers do it. And Teller was actually ashamed of that because he knew that Szilard was right. The petition never makes it to Truman's desk. He never sees it. The atomic bomb is used. But here we have this conflict between the scientists and the military. So this is going to cause scientists after the war to enter the political arena and try to educate the public and agitate for civilian control of atomic power. Groups like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who developed the Doomsday Clock to warn about the danger in 1947, included Einstein and Oppenheimer. The Federation of Atomic Scientists, which is now the Federation of American Scientists, and the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists that had Einstein, Szilard, and Linus Pauling, who would later receive the Nobel Prize for his work trying to stop nuclear fallout and prevent nuclear tests, and getting the test ban treaty to happen.
David,
right.
5.
Okay.
5.
I'm going to gloss over how controversial the decision to use the atomic bomb is, but you should know this. We're given this line that it was necessary to end the war and save lives. Actually, historically, that's malpractice to say. That is one argument that's made, but there are a lot of different arguments there, and I've got some on the screen there. We're going to skip over that. So in the Oppenheimer movie, we do see some of the controversy. We see Oppenheimer going into the meeting of how the gadgets are going to be used, and he uses that myth that it needs to be used to save lives. We also see him knocking a petition out of the hand of David Hill. That's the Rami Malek character who later testifies on his behalf. And Leo Szilard, that's the Szilard petition. We also see the interim committee with Secretary of War Stimson. He's taking Kyoto off the list. Again, it emphasized in that meeting the dominant myth they needed to use the atomic bomb to save lives. The problem is they decided to target a civilian city, not military installations. Even Burns tells Truman that they're going to target a military facility, which he writes in his diary. Press release announcing the Hiroshima bombing says that Hiroshima is a military facility. They're not telling the truth about bombing. And they don't show in the movie, and this is a horrible part of the movie, is they do not show the horror of the atomic bombing, which would be a horrific horror movie if they actually made it. They only refer to it obliquely, showing Oppenheimer is guilty. He never was really guilty about that. He always justified the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Next slide, please. He even, in 1945, he goes with General Leslie Groves to Trinity to dismiss stories that are coming out of radiation sickness. And in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hiroshima, about 70,000 people died instantaneously, and about doubled. Another 70,000 died later because of the injuries, burns, and the radiation sickness. The radiation sickness from the fallout was one of the big killers from the use of the nuclear weapons. And really, Americans didn't know what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki until over a year later when John Hersey comes out with Hiroshima in the New Yorker. That's also where we get that myth that it was necessary to save lives, because Stimson writes an op-ed in defense saying the A-bomb was necessary to save lives. This is where we get that myth. We really need to be able to reflect on what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and know the arguments for and against, because otherwise we're not morally dealing with our own responsibility. Oppenheimer finally meets with Truman on October 45. The meeting does not go well, like as in the movie, but not exactly. He tries to tell them that it needs to be international control. He doesn't have Truman's ear. Truman dismisses him as a crybaby for saying he has blood on his hands. He becomes a celebrity, and Oppenheimer then tries to move into being a statesman. He pushes for this international control, and scientists and civilians have pushed for the creation of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, civilian control of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And Oppenheimer would serve as the head of the advisory committee for that from 1947 to 1952. He wrote an international plan. The international plan did not go anywhere. It rested on Soviet and U.S. cooperation. It did not happen. It was idealistic. At the same time, the U.S. begins more nuclear testing at Bikini Atoll in 1946. That's going to run through 24 tests and continue until 1958. August 1949, the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb. There's a fuss in Washington, the military establishment, what to do about it. And they want to develop the super, Edward Teller's pet project of the hydrogen bomb. However, the Atomic Energy Commission's advisory committee, headed by Oppenheimer, unanimously rejected the proposal to create the hydrogen bomb. 8-0 vote. And I want to read this. The extreme danger to mankind inherent in the proposal fully outweighs any military advantage. That is a quote from that. However, Truman doesn't listen to the crybaby scientists. He overrules and decides to go forward with the hydrogen bomb, make the decision on January 31st, 1950. 1952, the US tests its first hydrogen bomb. What's going to happen next? 1953, the Soviet Union tests their first hydrogen bomb. Savannah River plant is a consequence. Produces polonium, plutonium, and tritium at Truman's direction in 1950. He asked DuPont to create this plant, to create this plutonium and tritium for hydrogen bombs for these weapons.
1 minute, Dave.
All right. So to really wrap it up, we didn't have to go on this arms race. These were really Truman's mistakes that amp up the arms race. And we can't trust the military or our political leaders to do the right thing. It really takes us to do the important work of opposing these dangerous weapons. The 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty is falling apart because of modernization. It was effective for a while, but there is a danger of countries getting nuclear weapons. And with SRS, let's talk about the expense. It's a justice issue. We should be spending that money on things we need, not unnecessary nuclear weapons. We haven't expanded Medicaid in South Carolina. We haven't provided healthcare. We need to provide infrastructure. Those are good jobs programs, because that's what it's all about for people here in Aiken. It's all about jobs. We want jobs programs, and to bring federal money to South Carolina, let's spend it on things that people need, not weapons that endanger everybody in the whole world. All right.
This is fantastic. Thank you, all three of our panelists. Wow, I have so many questions. I'm going to get into the most controversial one first. Let's hit this: nuclear weapons, needed or not. We know the U.S. has a huge stockpile, second only to Russia. The Department of Energy and the Pentagon are working with Congress to continue to fund the production of new plutonium pits, even though we know from Jay's discussion it's not needed. I want to talk about weapons grade plutonium. Jay, I'm going to kick this question to you. Is building up our nuclear arsenal beyond what we currently have actually seen as a deterrent to threats of other nuclear states? In other words, is Putin sitting in Russia looking at Aiken, South Carolina, quaking in his boots at the thought of SRS taking on the production of more plutonium pits?
Well, first of all, it so happens that something that I put in the chat just a minute ago might be relevant here. The bottom line point is neither the United States nor the Soviet Union, now Russia, have ever had just deterrence. It's always been a hybrid of deterrence and nuclear warfighting capabilities. And if you want to learn in horrifying detail what nuclear warfighting capability means, I strongly recommend The Doomsday Machine by the late, great Daniel Ellsberg, who died just, a month ago or something like that. But he was actually a nuclear war planner And again, I strongly recommend that book. And the bottom line of that book is once a limited nuclear war exchange begins, it's highly unlikely that it ends very quickly. It could end up being the eradication of the human race, going into, for example, nuclear winter, which our governments never tell us about. So just to conclude, to rephrase the question, is the current buildup necessary? Absolutely not. It's not about just deterrence to begin with. And as I tried to explain in my presentation, future PIP production is about speculative new designs. This whole modernization effort may actually undermine national security in a hardcore sense by introducing uncertainties into the already extensively tested stockpile that is known to be reliable. And finally, it could prompt the US into resuming testing, which would have very serious international proliferation consequences. So I'll leave it at that for the time being. But yeah, thank you for the question. That's certainly one that I like to address.
Tom, David, do you have any thoughts on this idea of the necessity?
The U.S. is a military superpower already, regardless of our nuclear arsenal. We haven't really found a use for them except for this deterrent, this deterrence, this ability to mutually destroy each other's countries that we've never really gotten to the point of, thank goodness, only by luck. If you listen to Curtis LeMay, Bombs Away LeMay, we would have ended the Cuban Missile Crisis by doing a preemptive nuclear attack on Russia. But, if we as a military, conventional superpower still have to cling to these nuclear weapons, how can we expect other countries to disarm? We have to stem the tide of nuclear proliferation, and we can't do it by being in a situation where do as I say, not as I do. We have to move toward more nuclear disarmament ourselves, and then we can ask other countries. It's also tied up in the question of war and peace. If countries are insecure, they're going to want to develop weapons. So we have to look at that on the grand scale as part of working toward nuclear nonproliferation. We also have to solve the problem of war and peace.
Penny, I have to interject. We had a lot of problems with our timing today. I want to make sure we can get to Q&A from our audience because we promised they would be able to ask questions.
Absolutely.
I know we had our set of questions that we were going to ask, but I think our audience needs this time, if that's all right.
Let me ask one more question, if I may, Pamela. And before I do that, Tom, did you have any thoughts on this notion of nukes as deterrence?
Just quickly, I won't go into detail, but if people listen to the justification given all the way down to local elected officials or other people here in South Carolina who support the money coming to the contractors, they use the word deterrence. It's all for deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. And even federal officials, and Jay's gone into it, but they need to be challenged for that. It's not about deterrence. It's about having a stockpile capable of fighting a full-scale nuclear war. And reporters and the rest of us should not let these people get away with throwing that word around like it was something innocuous, and that's really what they were basing nuclear weapons policies on when it's really not. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. And my final question before we go to the Q&A, everyone, this is your final warning. Let's get some questions in the Q&A. I wanted to talk a little bit about a topic that we deal with at the Sierra Club, which is this notion of a just transition for communities. And I'm wondering if you guys have given any thought about the 11,000 people who are currently working at SRS and what just transition might look like for the community that relies on those jobs. And I will leave it up to anyone who wants to grab that hot tamale.
Well, let me address it in some part.
Yeah.
This is not something that the Department of Energy is looking into, unfortunately. You look at I listed some of the contractors that are involved, and all of these sites are businesses, big corporations, and they are trying to make sure that the money is going to those corporations, and they do pay quite well. When the Cold War ended in 1990 or so, I thought there really was going to be a peace dividend and a conversion to more peaceful things. That really hasn't happened, and the current Secretary of Energy is doing nothing along these lines, which means we have to talk about it more. But I'm going to give her credit for one thing. Last week, the DOE did put out a kind of an initial proposal that land at various DOE sites, including Savannah River site, could be used for solar installations. And I really haven't read it, or I'm not following it, but there may be a crack here to try to get more conversion of Savannah Riverside jobs into actually clean energy, which they've got the brain power out there to do it. But what are they doing? They're actively recruiting workers from local tech colleges like Aiken Tech to work on plutonium pit production. And I think we really need to talk up that, for example, the solar initiative that has been presented. And I think we're going to hear more about it in the coming month or so. And I will try to post stuff on SRS Watch about that. But that's just one little thing that could be done is pursuing solar energy production at DOE sites, which have a vast amount of land. Savannah Riverside is 300 square miles. I think they identified 14,000 acres that potentially could be used for solar panels.
Jay, David, I know you lived in the area.
Well, the main mission right now at the Savannah River site is cleaning up those legacy wastes at SRS. So when you're talking about stopping new weapons production, you're not talking about a lot of jobs that exist yet. There are some jobs out there. The tritium extraction facility that harvests the tritium that makes all of the US's nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, is out there. So it is a bomb plant still, even though it's not producing plutonium anymore. But the main mission is that I'm all for conversion and finding ways to provide jobs for people who lose their jobs because we're not making as many nuclear weapons because we don't need to. That's fine. And honestly, instead of spending money on big defense contractors that require high expertise and pay high salaries, that money could be spread a lot more fairly, providing healthcare or building infrastructure throughout South Carolina. So again, it's the justice issue. How do we want to spend the money if we want to have a jobs program? Do we want to spend it on nuclear weapons that are unnecessary and dangerous? Or do we want to buy things that we actually need that'll improve the situation for people here in South Carolina?
Jay, any lessons from New Mexico?
Yeah. First of all, I described the rationale for, or at least as put out by the New Mexican congressional delegation, the rationale for expanding nuclear weapons programs in New Mexico is jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the threefold rationale. Now, that said, as a baseline, there's numerous economic studies that show that the economic multiplier, the beneficial economic multiplier for federal spending in the military is the lowest economic multiplier. Basically means for every dollar that the US government spends, there's $1.25 put back into the economy. Education, for example, has an economic multiplier of 4. So in terms of social well-being, military spending has the lowest economic multiplier. That said, I am pessimistic. As a baseline, 95% of the employees within the US nuclear weapons complex are contractor employees. Only 5% are feds overseeing them. This is a gigantic corporate profit machine that in effect has a monopoly. And we want a monopoly, for one thing. I'm quick to say, we don't want nuclear weapons work spread all across the country. But the point is that there are these key sites, 8 of them, within the NNSA nuclear weapons complex that have a monopoly that's driven by corporate profit. And, you know, I just close by saying I'm pessimistic about conversion. I just don't see it happening. Again, it's largely driven by corporate greed. I will just end by noting that reportedly Eisenhower, in his famous military industrial complex speech, at least in a draft, he had the military industrial congressional complex. And that's kind of the way I view it. The main congressional proponents of expanded PIP production are Lindsey Graham in South Carolina and Martin Heinrich in New Mexico. So, you know, sorry, I'm pessimistic. The other thing too is other socially beneficial, you know, modes of employment will